Hi there. My name is Ryan Hediger. I'm coming to you from Kent State University, which is traditional Iroquois land, and I'm happy to join friend Francesca and Scott on this panel. With thanks to Jeremy for his work in organizing the panel. My talk today is about, well, it's titled "Unfree Labor, Slavery, and the Anthropocene," and it's part of a bigger project I've been working on that centers on work norms and their relationship to questions of environment, climate crisis, and so on. Um, and I'm just going to jump in here. In his epilogue to the book "The Other Slavery: The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America," Andres Resendez discusses the fact that slavery and forced labor have not ended in contemporary times, persisting in a range of activities, including Asian sweatshops, American farming, and much more. Our histories, or our historiography, tends to emphasize progress in the movement of time, and the present is typically contrasted with a less enlightened past. But such logics of progress have come under fulsome critique in a range of ways in post colonialism, feminism, the environmental movement, and recently, of course, with the resurgent and expansive Black Lives Matter movement. A movement that underscores that racism and racist structures which are often constructed as past, are in fact present, much too present. Likewise, analysts of the Anthropocene often construct a progressive logic in which past actors had little idea how their actions impacted the environment. Only today, these accounts go, do we know what the consequences are. Now, I find a grain of truth in those kinds of analyses because our knowledge of environmental consequences is more robust than ever today. But in the book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, Christophe Bonville and Jean-Baptiste Frézeau offer a striking critique of the core premise, this idea that people in the past didn't recognize the harms done to the environment. They rely on a careful reading of history to show that awareness of harms to the environment and thereby to people and inhabitants of the land have long been part of the struggles that comprise history. Such realities, exemplified by his own case in Against the Grain by James C. Scott, Scott explores the ways in which reaching back to the dawn of agriculture, we can find some radical potentials in historical readings, in historiography. Scott argues basically that deep history exposes, quote, the many contingencies that came together to shape, say, the Industrial Revolution, the last glacial maximum, or the Qin dynasty. And for Scott, thinking about these big picture historical processes opens radically alternative potentials for the present and the future. Rethinking the past means rethinking the future, in effect. Resendez's account of Indian slavery performs a kind of similar revisionist task, detailing the extent and persistence of a reality that's too often ignored in the historical record. Resendez overturns the widespread belief that the only real victims of slavery were African. Of course, he mourns the horrors of the African slave trade, which involved some 12 million Africans. But Resendez notes that recent studies suggest, quote, if we were to add up all the Indian slaves taken in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, the figure would run somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million Indian slaves. This huge number approaches the scale of African slavery, and worse, the impact of European incursion into the Americas, pretty well-known history, including losses by disease, war, slavery, and more, was, again, quote, an even more catastrophic decline in the 16th and 17th centuries, end quote, of Indian populations than was experienced in West Africa. So the point isn't to have a contest of whose trauma was worse, but rather to demonstrate that the impact of slavery and colonial imperialism is wider and deeper than is customarily recognized. Like many historical truths, this one is often recognized by specialists, but not so widely understood beyond that. And I think this historical ignorance contributes to the deeper reality that I want to focus on today, which is part of this bigger project, which is the ways in which the impacts of slavery continue to echo through our lives in the present moment, in large part, I think, because our histories are too quick to distinguish the evil past from the virtuous present, simplifying the reality of slavery into a neatly contained and distantly past episode affecting only a single group. However, tragically, our historical narratives recognize the tragedy, but this way of putting it in the past it's a disservice, I think, to African descendants, and it also disserves other victims of slavery and the likenesses of slavery. So in effect, I think the importance of slavery to larger histories is contained in this softening device of progressivist improvement narratives. Narratives which I would argue forestall real interrogation of problems in contemporary life. Resendez offers another example in analyses of, quote, the new slavery that date its beginning with the end of World War II or the rise of neoliberalism. But Resendez calls these views myopic and instead writes, quote, I've tried to show that the mechanisms of coercion that underpin such practices are much older than many analysts realize, close quote. So his history reaches back to Columbus, comes all the way forward to the present, and demonstrates, among many other things, quote, the staying power and the extraordinary adaptability of slavery itself, close quote. So as I go on today in my talk, I'm going to focus especially on the development of the notion of free labor as distinct from enslaved labor, that distinction, showing how that still dominant distinction is insufficient because it accepts regimes and norms of labor under just under different terms. In other words, it naturalizes forms of free work that are A, not free, and B, historical, not universal, and therefore subject to debate and revision. So instead of, or maybe alongside valuing freedom, I suggest we embrace values of community and care as alternatives to extraction. Consider more of the history of abolition in the Americas. Each attempt to end slavery by the Spanish crown in the 16th century, by the New Mexican government in the early 19th century, by the US government later in the 19th century, each of these was met by subterfuge and sophisticated workarounds that permitted slavery to continue in varied forms all the way to the present. We can see one of those workarounds in the system of mass incarceration that Michelle Alexander condemns in her book, The New Jim Crow. She positions mass incarceration as a perpetuation of the larger history of race-based social control that reaches back through slavery and beyond. Like Resendez and like Bonwy and Frezo, I suggest that slavery and forced labor have been fundamental to the time period often now called the Anthropocene. It's a controversial term, of course. I'm not going to get into that today, but I'll use the term recognizing that it's got problems. What I want to do is reinforce the idea that slavery is a kind of effective shorthand for naming the ontological and practical changes wrought on human and non-human life and environments during the Anthropocene. And I don't have time to make this full case, but the work that I'm talking about today is forthcoming in a book that I'm editing with a number of great contributors. The book is called Planet Work, Rethinking Labor and Leisure in the Anthropocene. It's going to be coming out from Bucknell University Press sometime. We don't know the publication date yet, but soon. Okay, so another way to put this is that the period often called the Anthropocene is also in many ways a slaveryocene. This is not a new claim. Many others have emphasized the importance of slavery and its logics in terms of their impact on the environmental crisis. A couple are Anna Singh and Donna Haraway. They talk about this. But I think we need to dwell longer on this point as part of the larger need to radically rethink our norms of work. I would, for example, note the striking continuities between the development of modernity and the importance of slavery and its near kin, forced labor, indentured servitude, and so on. And it's funny because you make this argument. On the one hand, it sounds radical. I'm comparing contemporary work to slavery. On the other hand, it seems obvious. And this is a strange paradox, I think, that it's the kind of paradox that courses along so many analyses of the horrors of modernity. One example of this is when Douglas A. Blackman discussed the response he received on National Public Radio to his shocking book. It's really shocking if you don't know this book, Slavery by Another Name. Um, the book gives an account of a labor system that basically recreated slavery in the American South right up until World War II. And when he heard about this, NPR host Bob Edwards said, "I guess it's really no surprise." So we think we know the horrors of racism. It's familiar. Or consider Ira Berlin's opening to his important book, Many Thousands Gone, the first 2 centuries of slavery in North America. Berlin points out, quote, that slavery was both a model and a metaphor for the most extreme forms of exploitation, otherness, and even social death, close quote. So slavery functions as a template and a shorthand. It remains a powerful idea, but it's also treated as a kind of historical horror and an anomaly, right? That we've sort of moved beyond in the progressive actions of social justice and historical improvement. So these are conflicting ideas, right? Slavery is over, slavery's not over. Slavery's too horrible for comparison. We use slavery for comparison constantly. What's going on with these disjunctions? Again, as I suggested before, I think it's a failure of historical perspective that fails to recognize the importance of slavery to contemporary life. And that's one way to summarize a lot of the recent work by historians on this subject. Work by Edward Baptist, Sven Beckert, Michelle Alexander, Douglas Blackman. Their work basically sets the path for my central argument that in the logic of slavery, we have this endless dialogue between freedom and shackles, which sets far more of the terms of the Enlightenment and of capitalism than is widely recognized. I think we continue to work under a model of labor that borrows a lot from the tradition of slavery, and we live in a world that's deeply reliant on the logic and outcomes of extraction that animated and animate slavery. In other words, to propose alternatives to the Anthropocene, we have to require alternatives to this logic of objectification, labor, and slavery. I want to talk about a few relevant examples. And again, I'm kind of just skimming over this history to paint this broader picture and to kind of establish the outlines of this larger argument. A few relevant examples. One, the most obvious one, the glaring one, is COVID-19. I think the pandemic has been especially striking as a revelation of how citizens have internalized work norms and also now increasingly have come to resist them. And we don't really know where this is going to go. You know, the reporting that's coming out, day by day emphasizes the way in which we are maybe at a watershed moment in terms of a change in work norms. But you consider like some of the anti-lockdown protesters who equated freedom with the opportunity to work, connecting two domains that are in other ways opposed, right? Because at work, this is what we do. We surrender many of our routine freedoms. So that's kind of a paradox. I'm free to work, but at work, I'm not free. Some of the protesters' feelings about work are, of course, practical. People recognize that to maintain a place like a home, a social role, etc., especially in modern America, you have to work. Work's the obligation, and infamously in the United States, there's little safety net for those unable to work for whatever reason, due to their own circumstances, due to social realities like recessions, systematic racism, pandemics. We could call this attitude towards work workism. This is a term passed on by Derek Thompson in a piece in The Atlantic. And it's meant to evoke this term workism, to evoke the ways that norms of work function almost like an illness or a syndrome or a kind of addiction. I think this is hard for us to hear because work is so often seen as the center of moral decency in modern life. I'm suggesting we need to bracket that norm and question it, to recognize its links to more obviously harmful social forms like slavery. over the longer term, I think, even as slavery's steadily been outlawed and workers have been increasingly protected by various legal regimes, there are also really important contrary trends. We mentioned slavery has not ended. There's the decline of trade unions, especially in the United States. There's the rise of gig work, the advent of what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, and a lot more. So what has remained naturalized in this kind of swirling context around work? What's remained naturalized is the very idea and practice of labor norms that guide our days and our years. Of course, not everybody's subject to those norms equally. Some people are excluded entirely if they can subsist on rents or if they have some other kind of superior position. But the norms are still basically in place. So what I want to suggest is our insistence on condemning slavery should not blind us to the ways in which core elements of slavery persist inside free labor practices today. The range of ways in which this is true are demonstrated in the 2016 essay collection called Slavery's Capitalism, in which a host of scholars demonstrate how various workplace practices were gestated in the system of slave labor. To mention just a few, just to go through a few of the essays from that book. I think many of us are familiar with the efficiencies brutalized and wrung out of slaves in the late 18th and 19th centuries via, quote, punishment, increased surveillance, decreased breaks, and lockstep labor, close quote, that were part of the cotton production process and were important, Edward Baptist argues, and that's who I'm quoting, they were important in reshaping the economy of the Atlantic and then the economy of the globe. Baptist, of course, has done a lot to show how fundamental slavery and violence in slavery were to the rise of modern capitalism. But there are other kind of more minor cultural and economic changes that are rooted in slavery too. Again, I'm reporting to you from Slavery's Capitalism, that book. Caitlin Rosenthal details the way slavers kept detailed records of how much cotton, sugar, rice, wheat, and other staples were picked by each enslaved person every day, and then annually, which facilitated the focused use of violence to speed production. So we have to see the acts of violence in dialogue with a larger system of recording that made the violence focused and more effective, more horrible too. But Rosenthal calls slavery a laboratory for the use of accounting. So, accounting is rolled into this. Another essay by Daniel B. Rood retells the story of the McCormick Reaper, which was made famous for its use in the so-called settling of the West as part of free labor. And yet Rood shows that, quote, this quintessentially American machine was a Creole artifact, a tropical technology, and more than anything, a product of Atlantic slavery. So far from our association or the common association of this machine with the sort of free and open West, it is in fact produced under the duress of slavery and then, used in the West. Thus, claiming the, contested West was facilitated by a slavery-made device. Okay, another essay in this same book. Bonnie Martin adds to Edward Baptist's work, Baptist's important history, The Half Has Never Been Told. In that book, he demonstrates, among other things, the importance of enslaved persons as collateral for international finance. So, people would use slaves as collateral. In his article in Slavery's Capitalism, Baptist shows that enslaved people constituted in their bodies almost 1/5 of all national accounting wealth, a far higher proportion of its liquid wealth. People were essential to notions of wealth during slavery. So Bonnie Martin, engages with this to demonstrate the ways that there was a kind of personal side to this too, in a smaller scale system of collateral, neighbor lending money to neighbor. And again, they use the same system. They would use slaves as collateral. So you have it on a massive scale, you have it on a more local scale. But in all those cases, the wealth built via these kind of economic innovations, fed each stage of economic development and continue to drive contemporary life and commercial practices. I mean, these core economic historical realities are still sort of operating inside the culture by way of economic differences and all the other things we could talk about. So we have to say that all free labor systems rely in their history on slave labor regimes. So in light of this heritage and these answers to it, I want to come back to Resendez and his discussion of free labor, which is striking. He recognizes that there's no single vision of what free labor entailed in the mid-19th century United States, but advocates tended to insist, quote, that every man should be entitled to the fruits of his labor, and that the gendered language is there. Resendez goes on, he says, they repeated this phrase over and over like a mantra, beginning with President Abraham Lincoln, again, still Resendez, who had become the greatest ideologue and most conspicuous advocate of free labor. As Resendez notes, this vision of economic and political independence resonated for Lincoln with his own experience as a young person working on the small farms in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. Right? Work hard on the frontier. This is a quintessentially American notion of not only labor, development, progress, but decency. And I think many of us have this kind of mantra internalized in us. We live in a world that valorizes free labor as a cultural and moral backbone. But if we pause here, we can note the obvious but maybe insufficiently appreciated point. Lincoln's youthful experiences were on the frontier, part of the process of radically changing the inhabitancy, the ecology, and the politics of what is now often called North America. That process depended fundamentally upon the notion of manifest destiny and upon the racist rejections of indigenous inhabitants, of course, the many Indian peoples. So free labor in its actual historical reality and specificity is part of settler colonialism. And the notion captured by Resendez that it was repeated like a mantra by abolitionists gives us just the right way to grasp its kind of quasi-religious character. The notion of free labor, though preferable in very clear ways to chattel slavery, is still part of colonial imperialism, excusing a regime of governance built precisely on rejecting other possible ways of being, other, well, for lack of a better term, economic regimes, such as the mixed and flexible practices of the Dene, the Navajo in the Southwest, who in Lincoln's era raised sheep, tended agricultural fields, fruit trees and gardens, and hunted and gathered too. So when we think of history this way, the fact that American jurisprudence refused to convincingly condemn Indian slavery, which again Resendez shows, this fact takes additional resonance. As Resendez reports, for instance, when faced with the possibility of entrusting Indians with the rights of American citizenship, such as voting, the Supreme Court refused on racist grounds. The case was Elk versus Wilkins. It was 1884, and the majority opinion argued that the question of whether Indians had, quote, become so far advanced in civilization that they could be permitted the privileges and responsibilities of citizenship, the court said, should be answered by the nation at large, not by the court. In other words, this remained an unsettled question that the Supreme Court refused to adjudicate. Were Native peoples, Indian peoples, human enough to be citizens? This decision seems to imply that the whole national project of the United States, that is, the particular shape it actually took, could be cast into doubt by recognizing the humanity of Indian peoples across cultural and political difference. Instead of finding common cause, which was possible there in that decision, the Supreme Court relied on a notion of exaggerated difference, I think, to continue to operate as an engine of ongoing conquest, which is at the heart of United States history and before that colonial history. Perhaps even more surprisingly to contemporary forms of meaning and culture, this mantra-like insistence on the value of ostensibly free labor frames a dispute in clear terms. Slave free. In that distinction that runs through the Enlightenment, this is a really common distinction. We think about it it's all across the political spectrum. In fact, I think we equate freedom with the good. But that framing obscures more fundamental tensions mentioned above, tensions that we bring to the fore in this forthcoming volume of essays that I mentioned, Planet Work, tensions between labor and something else. What is that something else? I mean, today we often say labor and leisure, and that's the framework we use in the book, but we use it in the book knowing that seeing leisure as the opposite of leisure is itself a consequence of the triumph of labor ideology. So I suggest that we need to put that opposition, labor versus leisure, into question also. So what's the opposite of labor then? Maybe life? Maybe care? I mean, informally, don't we often feel like our lives begin where work leaves off? At least in one framework. Maybe, though that kind of view introduces a serious shock to regimes of life and labor that remain dominant today. Regimes that naturalize and universalize labor as fundamental to life, not as opposed to it. So I want to end today with that idea that, first of all, to restate the question, what is the opposite of labor? And maybe we should be doing more of whatever that is, if we want our activities, our undertakings to do something besides continuing to destroy the earth. Thank you for listening.